Okay, what is sustainable gold mining? Well, I think the World Gold Council sums it up pretty well with responsible gold mining across the mine life cycle, taking the three central factors of measuring sustainability, environmental, social, and corporate governance, or ESG, into account. I'm just going to focus on one part of the environment being related to climate and energy, being greenhouse gas emissions. The main takeaway that I would like you to think about is more from a climate risk and value perspective. Oops, which way's forwards? There we go. The key climate risks to gold mining are water scarcity and extreme weather events, which has put greenhouse gas emissions clearly in the spotlight. To understand greenhouse gas emissions, we need to understand how they are reported. This is commonly as totals of Scope 1 and 2 emissions, as emissions intensities, and may include an estimate of Scope 3 emissions. In this presentation, I'm going to focus on and use emissions intensity as my main variable. These are the two most common greenhouse gas emissions intensities reported by gold mining companies. The first is reported by gold or gold equivalent ounces produced, and the second is by ore tonnes processed. And depending on how they're reported, different interpretations can result. Underground mines have the lower and open pit mines the higher emissions intensity when it's reported by gold ounces produced, with the opposite true for emissions intensities reported by ore tonnes processed. The emissions intensity per ounce is affected by a change in gold grade, where an increase in the gold grade leads to a lower emissions intensity and vice versa. It is related to the saleable product gold, whereas the emissions intensity per ore tonnes processed is not affected by changes in gold grade, nor directly relatable to the saleable product, which can hide the impact of things like declining gold grades, which is a common scenario in today's gold mines. Both intensities have their advantages, and using them together allows a more robust interpretation of why a change in emissions intensity might have occurred, whether it was due to actual change in conditions within the mine or actual measures to actually reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And if you're only going to report one, my personal preference is by gold ounces produced. Here we have the Australian gold mines greenhouse gas emissions intensity versus real all-in sustaining costs from 2014 through to 30th of June 2018. And there's some quite simple relationships that exist between them, with the higher gold grades indicating lower costs and lower greenhouse gas emissions intensities. The mines noted there at the time, obviously Gwalia and Mount Carlton, were high-grade underground and open pit mines respectively. Cadia plots away from the rest of the underground mines. Oh dear, button issues. Mainly because of the completely different mining method being block cave, panel cave. You've got Sunrise, a lower grade open underground mine, Telfer the lowest grade open pit and underground mine, and Edna May and Boddington, both sort of low grade open pits at the time. And in the study, there were some data points, these 4 through here, which don't show up here too well, but in other graphs they did, that they were coming out as outliers. And these are the Fosterville and Stawell mines. And in the data, there was no obvious reasons why when looking at them in terms of emissions, productions and cost data. And this really sort of highlights the importance of understanding the energy source of the mines and interpreting of the data. Both mines are connected to the Victorian electricity grid, which is dominated by energy generated from brown coal, which is the most greenhouse gas emissions intensive electricity in Australia. Okay. Greenhouse gas emissions intensities can be used to identify emission-intensive mining assets as mines with higher potential carbon risk, Presented here are the greenhouse gas emissions intensities of the Australian gold mines, like a cost curve as at 30th of June 2018. Most of individual mines, but some are aggregates of mines, as the granularity in the data at the time wasn't available. That has improved. They range from just under 250 kilograms of CO2 equivalent per ounce to just over 1,000 kilograms of CO2 equivalent per ounce. And when you look at this, does this potentially have any future sort of investment implications? If there was carbon conscious investors or where millennials might want to put their money but wanted exposure to gold mining, where would they invest? The lowest quartile is dominated by underground mines, and the majority of the highest quartile is open pit mines. And this is before Goldfields at their Agnew mine, which is presently at number 3 here, put in place the first sort of integrated wind solar microgrid, which will move it into first place. And 4 of the 5 lowest intensity mines there have all taken measures to abate greenhouse gas emissions. And you can sort of distill the information of these previous 2 slides into a conceptual Australian gold mine. And it can start off as open pit. It has the lowest costs, but it has the highest emissions intensity. And as the mine sort of transitions, they look to go underground and have some satellite open pits. The costs go up and the greenhouse gas emissions intensity comes down. And then it transitions to fully underground. The costs come down a bit and the emissions intensity drops again. And on average, over the change from open pit to underground in Australia, the emissions intensity comes down 40%. Therefore, there is like a natural progression to lower emissions intensity mines, but we need to consider the impact of declining gold grades. So how does Australia fit in with the world stage? Here is the country-weighted average greenhouse gas emissions intensity curve. Finland has the lowest, and South Africa over 20 times greater, the highest. If you're an investor, where you're going to put your money if you're looking for gold mining in terms of emissions? Compared to other countries, Australia is still at the higher end, but it's still in the lower part. Canada's average down here is 2.5 times less than Australia's, and South Africa's average is way higher. It's over 1,000 kilograms of CO2 equivalent per ounce higher than Australia's highest intensity mine. In this data set, in the mines and behind it, the Macassa mine in Canada had the lowest greenhouse gas emissions intensity, around 53 kilograms of CO2 per ounce. Now it benefits from low emissions energy, high grade underground mine. It uses almost an entirely electric mining fleet. It's about 80% electric. And on the flip side, 100 times higher is the Cook mine in South Africa, which was 5.3 tonnes of CO2 equivalent per ounce. China's not on there, but we've done an estimate for this based on a life cycle and assessment study, and the estimate came out at about 1,200 kilograms of CO2 per ounce. And the primary reason for these differences is the source of the country's energy. Countries with low emissions energy, such as hydroelectricity, nuclear, or renewables, versus those with high emissions energy dominated by fossil fuels. Using those average country emissions intensities, the impact of a hypothetical carbon price on sort of average gold mine production costs can be estimated. You can also think of this as like a shadow carbon price or an internal carbon price. So geographically, we have here the average increase in cost per ounce in gold mining production costs, and you can see there's quite a bit of variation there. And the blue bar is like a US $50 per tonne carbon price, and the red's $100 US per tonne carbon price. And of the world's top 5 producing countries, Canada receives the least impact, followed by the USA, Australia, Russia, and it's estimated China would have the highest. Like this, the emissions intensity, this is directly related to the energy sources used at the gold mines. And as you can see, South Africa clearly suffers the greatest impact, from a hypothetical carbon price. In Australia, gold grades have been declining and they're forecast to decline further. And this isn't causing the average emissions intensity in Australia to rise. It's risen 40% from a previous study, and it's predicted that the average grade will drop to just over a gram by 2029, which, depending on the type of mine, the emissions intensity will increase by up to nearly 50%. So declining gold grades over time can actually wipe out any gains made by real reductions in total greenhouse gas emissions on an emissions intensity basis per ounce. So climate risks are financial risks, and what are some of the financial investment and value implications of carbon risk when looking at it from the view that a higher greenhouse gas emissions intensity means a higher carbon risk and vice versa? So you've got companies, institutional funds and lenders are being asked to increase disclosure and mitigate climate risks through lowering their greenhouse gas emissions footprints. Now, this pressure is leading them to not invest in companies and assets with a higher carbon risk, which will lead to companies disposing of or discontinuing high greenhouse gas emissions intensity mining operations if methods to abate emissions are not feasible. Having a lower carbon risk allows companies access to lower cost equity and debt capital, which implies a higher firm value to a company with a higher carbon, to a company than that which has a higher carbon risk. And the impact on value has been shown for companies, also showing a strong carbon risk awareness and good disclosure of greenhouse gas emissions and carbon risk. Undertaking activities to abate greenhouse gas emissions through energy substitution or energy efficiencies reduces the greenhouse gas emissions intensity, hence the carbon risk. So not addressing carbon risk, could this lead to potential stranded assets in the gold industry? For example, are there few at risk in South Africa? Is there the potential for gold from low emissions footprint to be valued more than gold from a high emissions footprint, like a low carbon, green gold premium? We had Robert Friedland in the Mining News recently talking about this related to copper and how he envisages ESG will change how metals are priced. Mining companies are very good at sort of communicating their production and associated cost statistics, but from what I've observed from my research, in terms of emissions, it can be good to lip service to meaningful insights, but normally it's just informational, a little bit here and there. And generally what's communicated is poor, and when it comes to interpreting what the data is telling me, using appropriate metrics, being asked which ones are best to use. Gold producers are saying they're being lumped in with coal by investors. How do we differentiate ourselves? How do we not be associated with coal? Scope 3 emissions, do I need to do anything about them? They're very different for different commodities. Not understanding the benefits of good disclosure and communication of greenhouse gas emissions versus the ramifications of none or poor disclosure and communication can make them understand the financial risks. Climate risks are financial risks, and it is never too early to start addressing them. There are financial benefits for good disclosure, being carbon aware or having a climate change plan, and being able to access lower cost equity and debt. And these benefits are not only just for large companies, also for junior companies. Being able to demonstrate a lower carbon risk should lead to a higher firm value. The challenges are declining gold grades, and messaging interpretation that could be greatly improved to show mining in a better positive light, and being aware that the potential ramifications, could you suffer from lower values, lack of investor interest, unwanted assets. CSA Global is supported by ARM with respect to sustainability and climate advisory services and are working in this space now. Feel free to come and discuss any component of this presentation or my recently published paper, Greenhouse Gas Emissions and Production Cost Footprints in Australian Gold Mines. Thank you.
Good on you. Thanks very much, Sam. Thanks, Sam, and thanks CSA Global.